My name is Sandy Schulman. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Security and Crime Science at University College London. And my research examines risk factors as well as ways to prevent extremism, radicalization, and terrorism. Extremism is basically the active or vocal opposition of the core values of a society. So radicalization is the process by which an individual actually adopts the willingness or develops a stronger willingness to use violence to pursue political, religious, economic, social justice goals. So this is a process that happens over time. And if we think about the difference between extremism and violent extremism, we can then consider the process of radicalization as the process by which someone who initially adopts extremist beliefs then comes to consider violence as a legitimate action in order to execute their goals or pursue and advance their goals. So the extreme right, those would be individuals, actors, movements that follow right-wing ideology. So they support nativism, they support a certain hierarchy in society, authoritarianism, and so on. But they also reject core aspects of democracy. Now, the radical right, on the other hand, also pursues right-wing ideology, but they do not reject the essence of democracy. They only reject liberal democracy. So, for instance, minority rights or the separation of power. So in this conversation, we will speak about the extreme right. Far-right actors, radical right, extreme right actors have been using the internet from the very early days of the internet. And of course, in these early days, what was mostly available were static websites that they developed. So their own websites. And these websites are still important today. They've advanced. They often now include sort of multimedia aspects. They would have podcasts, vlogs, etc. But these own websites are really important. They're an important part of the ecosystem because they make this ecosystem quite resilient. An example I want to mention here is a study that looked at the effects of deplatforming far-right actors. And what that study found was that although certain actors might have been deplatformed from a mainstream social media platform, they did not necessarily lose overall support because they had in place a very resilient ecosystem made up of their own website, forums, etc., that basically just replaced what was previously happening on the social media platform. So these static websites, even the more advanced version, although they often might feel a little bit old school, they're very important. The extreme right also uses, and this is perhaps a bit less commonly known, a platform that is actually a decentralized social media platform. It's called Minds. So Minds is a blockchain-based social network, has existed for a couple of years, and it basically links your typical social media features with the added benefits, some may say, of gaining tokens and cryptocurrencies. So it's actually a perfect recipe for disaster, if you want, because you could financially incentivize individuals for expressing extremist opinions or perhaps violent extremist opinions. There are also a couple of large forums that extreme right actors use. So Stormfront is a really well-known one. It's studied extensively because it's public, so anyone can access it and study it. There's also Iron March or Iron Forge. And these forums, if you look at them, again, they often might feel a little bit old school, but they provide a real rich insight into the strategies that the extreme right uses online. So for instance, Stormfront, just in case you choose not to actually look it up yourself. On there, you will find everything from basically dating sub-forums to forums that provide educational resources for children. But it also includes a sub-forum where they actually invite those who do not agree with white supremacist ideology to talk to them. So it's basically a place where they invite opponents to discuss with them. The far right, so it's the extreme right and also the radical right, are engaging in a diverse range of cultural enterprises. So we have the white power music scene, we have dedicated publishing houses, that publish books, magazines, etc. And they obviously also all have an online presence. There are e-shops where you can buy extreme right merchandise and so on. So all of this together, as I said, creates a quite resilient, varied, and global ecosystem that allows extreme right actors to share their ideology and propaganda across borders, and despite efforts by policymakers, by platforms, by law enforcement to obviously tackle and counter those activities. So these messages in general, far-right ideology appeals or might appeal to people for various reasons. So first of all, we always have to consider the context, the political context, the economic context in which people live their lives. And it is, for example, very well established that if individuals perceive a certain threat to their livelihoods, to their jobs, but maybe also to their way of living, so to their traditions, how things are done, they are more likely to then oppose or derogate that entity, that group of people that is considered to be a threat. So anti-immigrant sentiments or anti-Muslim sentiments, for instance, are related to experiences of terrorist attacks, or related to experiences of an increase of immigration. It would be those societal trends that elicit a certain threat. And if people experience the threat, they are then more likely to support actors or politicians, or also extremist groups, that tell them, first of all, that their threat is legitimate, that what they experience is real, but also that they can help them to solve that problem and that they can help make that threat go away. So whenever we try to understand why a particular ideology appeals to people, I would very much encourage to not just look at individual level characteristics, such as people's attitudes or even their intellectual capabilities, but actually try to understand the social context in which they live. This often gives us a lot of insight. So it's no surprise that after 2015 in Europe, for instance, we've seen an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment. It's a textbook case, for instance, and some of the other messaging, so for instance, conspiracy theories, they often resonate with people because they provide a very simple solution to a really complex problem. So something like the global economy imploding or exploding. Nobody really knows why this happens and what we can do to fix it. Well, I hope some people do, but in general, this is a very complex problem. Now, if you feel that you might lose your job or you're no longer able to pay for your mortgage, you very much welcome people who give you an easy explanation for why this happens, and who also sort of give you a scapegoat that you can blame. And so this is why conspiracy theories, they're often structured in a very simple way, and it is those messages, it's that messaging that people who are stressed, who are experiencing certain life stressors, would find appealing because it makes them feel slightly relieved. Let's say you believe in the Great Replacement narrative. You feel like you're very special because you're one of the few people who actually has figured out what's going on. Yeah. So those who develop and disseminate those theories make sure to do so in a way that it seems like a quite elite experience. Yeah. So now imagine you're believing something that is actually the explanation for what is happening, but very few people know that. So you feel special. You're part of a small group. That group, I'm thinking here about QAnon, for instance, which, also very much is an online phenomenon. Not exclusively, but it's where it was born. This is where it manifests largely. So that group can connect online. You can talk with others very easily who share your beliefs. And in doing so, you obviously start developing a certain identity that is associated with the conspiracy theory. And the stronger we identify with a certain idea or group, yeah, and this can be anything from the food you like to eat to, of course, your nationality and so on. But the stronger we are identified with that, the harder it is for us to accept any opposition, any points of views that might reject what we believe in. Yeah, and so you can see how if people might be initially attracted to those theories because they might explain certain situation in their life, they may then find a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, start talking with other people. The closer they then get to integrating that idea as a central part of their self, it harder it will be for them to change their mind. So even if eventually it is to the outsider very obvious that this just doesn't add up, or there's now a lot of counter evidence, once you're really deeply in it, it's hard to change people's minds. And we see this across the board, right? Like any attitude that is really strongly held is extremely hard to change. And any attitude that is really strongly held is also a strong predictor for behavior. So, people start changing who they talk to, changing where they go shopping and all of that. And it can be hard to cycle back from that. Extreme right actors are aware of the various countermeasures that are being put in place by platforms, yeah? So they know that certain content will be removed very quickly. So in that sense, they've obviously started adapting their content for it to be more palatable on those platforms where they know the perhaps more violent material would be removed quickly. So this is a mere response to the countermeasure, and those working in terrorism or in counterterrorism know that phenomena very well, that any counterterrorism effort, for instance, often sparks actually technological innovation because the terrorist actors adapt their methods, adapt their weapons such that in the future they will not be detected. So we see the same in terms of the kind of messages that are being disseminated on different platforms. And of course, extreme right actors also know the certain basics of good marketing. Yeah, they know that images work really well. They know that memes work really well to create viral material that disseminates quickly across networks. So they do that. They do that very well. In fact, when it comes to memes, packaging, humor, and the symbolism of far-right ideology into a meme. Pepe the Frog is one of these iconic memes that has been used. So especially if we think about let's say the recruitment of individuals who are not yet aligned with your beliefs, who do not yet agree that it is okay to derogate minorities, or who, even worse, do not yet aspire to the use of violence. If you want to capture someone, an audience that doesn't agree with that yet, you cannot immediately confront them with your most extreme material. Yeah, you will start off with something very innocent. So one paper I read yesterday, for instance, they were speaking about a public Facebook page related with an extreme right actor, and the images that were portrayed there were those of good-looking white women. Yeah, very innocent and obviously potentially appealing to certain audience. Now, from that public Facebook page, individuals were then gradually taken to public groups and then to private groups, and the material that was presented then in these subsequent settings became increasingly less innocent, and actually a great case study that further illustrates this is a study that was done by Daniel Köhler in Germany, who looked at 2 cases of children who were drawn into the extreme right in Germany through online gaming. And much of that happened on Discord, actually, Discord servers. But it started on a platform called Roblox, which is an online gaming platform. And these children were playing games related to World War II. And they were approached there by a other gamer who initially started talking to them about the game, then took that child into a private group on Roblox, and from there to a Discord server. And only on the Discord server was far-right ideology and no longer the actual game the main topic of the discussion. Yeah, so because it would have been much harder to communicate that content in the other setting. So we see that content is adapted, of course, based on the restrictions of the sites, but also content has to be adapted because you need to approach people slowly and expose them gradually to more and more extreme material for them to actually progress on the radicalization journey. When I speak about extremist content, I include hate speech. Not everyone does that, so I just want to mention this. Now, there are, depending on the data source, and then depending on your definition of what you consider extremist content, very different numbers that are floating around. So, for instance, Bertie Wittgen and colleagues, they did a study of various social media platforms focusing on hate speech in particular, and they showed that on the mainstream platforms, there was between 0.001 and 1% of content that could be classified as hate speech. On what we call these fringe platforms or alt tech platforms like Gab, this might go up to 8%. Then another data source we have are victimization surveys. So these would be general population surveys where people report how frequently they are exposed to hate speech, for instance. So here we see numbers between 50 and 80% of observing hate speech, so not being directly victimized. And one study found 20% of adolescents in that case were themselves the victims of hate speech. If we look at law enforcement data, the numbers are very small again. Yeah, so we have platform data relatively small, victimization survey relatively prevalent, law enforcement data relatively few, and this is for hate speech. And not everyone, as I said, considers that extremist content. A study that we've just finished looked specifically at violent extremist content. So this is not hate speech. This is material that explicitly advocates the use of violence to pursue political, religious, or social justice goals, borderline terrorist content. And here we find, first of all, that approximately 7% of the general population would over their whole lifetime actively look for that material. So that is not so much speaking to the prevalence, but it tells us a little bit about how many people would actually want to engage with that, which is perhaps a big number. It depends. Yeah, This is a conversation we still need to have as a society, how big of a number we're comfortable with. So that's 7%. And in this study that we just finished recently, we also found, though, that the large majority of people, at least when it comes to the violent extremist content, will never be exposed. So we don't really yet know how prevalent it is, considering all the information that's on the internet. But what is maybe more interesting and more important to know is that most people are likely not exposed, at least to the most violent content. And the group that we really should be worried about, so those who are exposed and who are also vulnerable to actually being influenced when they are exposed, might be around 10 to 20%. If someone who already agrees with far-right ideology or with the extreme right ideas, if they are exposed to that content, that might be because they're looking for it or because it's incidental exposure, they obviously see their existing opinions confirmed. Yeah. And there's a huge literature looking, of course, at sort of confirmation biases, but also looking at selective media use. So what does it mean for an individual to be confronted with information that actually aligns with their identity? One framework that I particularly like is Slater's reinforcing spirals model. And what he argues is that if someone who agrees with the content that they are confronted with, that particular aspect of the self, that particular opinion will become very salient. Salient is a quite scientific term, but it basically just means that that thought, that idea, that opinion is at the forefront of your mind. Yeah, you can almost imagine it sort of blinking in the front of your mind. And that then means that if this idea is salient, you will consider all subsequent behavior, all subsequent interactions through the lens of that salient idea. So, for instance, you might then choose to pick up also a certain newspaper. All subsequent media selection might be in line with that idea, but it also goes as far as the people you want to interact with in quote-unquote offline, real-world environments. I don't like this distinction between real-world and online, but I think we know what I mean. And so it will become influential in your behavior. One thing I want to highlight here, and this is also something that we can take away from the reinforcing spirals model, this doesn't mean that those existing attitudes become more extreme. So this is often a story that is being discussed in the context of, online radicalization and so on. There's this idea that if people get confronted with ideas that they believe in, those ideas then develop into these very extreme viewpoints. Here, I mean extreme. If we think of a dimension, people shift further and further to the poles and don't stay in the center. We don't actually have good empirical evidence to suggest that. And what the reinforcing spirals model would rather suggest, and what we have also shown in the study, is that this confirmation of your attitudes really results in a stable maintenance. So those attitudes remain stable, strong. They don't become more extreme. And that's a very different scenario. And it opens up a whole different conversation, I think, because it is, of course, also important to understand how, if someone has already quite strong right extremist, if someone has already quite strong extreme right ideas, how can we move them away from that? Confirming their views will keep that viewpoint stable, but it doesn't necessarily spiral into a more extreme version. There are certain scenarios when this might happen, but in the most common scenario, we will speak of what is called attitude maintenance. So this is sort of focusing on people who already agree with the content. Now let's look at the internet users who might be exposed to this problematic material, but it's not relevant for them. They don't agree with those viewpoints. Yeah. Now, what we know from the literature is that, especially if this exposure is repeated, yes, there will be memory traces. Yeah, so people will remember that they've seen this material, which is why also in victimization surveys, you will then have quite high prevalence of people remembering that they have seen hate speech. It doesn't necessarily mean that that hate speech affected their attitudes and their behavior. Why is that? So if we get confronted with information that is not relevant to us, that is not aligned with our beliefs, with our ideas, this information is not processed systematically. It's not given the sufficient amount of attention and cognitive resources that it's required to actually then change attitudes or even influence behavior. Those people we spoke about first, who do believe that material is relevant, there we would expect systematic processing. Yeah, they will not just remember, but as I said, for them, their existing attitudes get confirmed and remain more stable. But if I don't actually agree with the far-right ideology and I get confronted with it, there is, if we don't think about any additional variables, there's at first no reason to believe that exposure to this content should change attitudes such that they then become aligned with the hateful material. Now, we can, of course, have a whole bunch of other negative implications to those individuals. Yeah, if they are, for instance, the target group. Yeah, let's think about anti-Muslim hate speech. If you are an internet user who self-identifies as Muslim, of course, there will be negative emotions. Yeah, there are severe mental health implications of exposure. When I say that I wouldn't initially expect effects on attitudes and behavior, I mean here in line with the hateful material. So this is important to keep in mind, because it also means that if we want to consider who to protect, who to focus on, if we want to prevent and counter a radicalization based on this material, it is, on one hand, those individuals who already agree with the material that should be part of our target group. Now, a second target group who's vulnerable are individuals who are, based on previous life experiences, based on a set of variables, which I explore in a second, are considered to be in general more susceptible to radicalization. So those individuals, if they are exposed, they might not yet agree with far-right ideology, but they think in a certain way, they look at the world in a certain way, which then makes it more likely that they will be convinced to adopt those viewpoints, and further down the line to perhaps also adopt the idea that it is legitimate to use violence to pursue those extremist ideas. So the research has identified numerous variables that would define the susceptibility. I'm just going to focus here on a handful of them. So one thing that we have looked at as well are different cognitive styles. That basically just means how people think. And cognitive rigidity, as well as cognitive flexibility, sounds similar, it's different, have been associated with higher susceptibility to radicalization. That means those are individuals who look at the world in a black and white manner. For them, it's either like this or like that. Yeah, and this refers to all sorts of topics. They find it very difficult to engage with ambiguous information, to sort of look at nuances in between situations. And then there are also individuals who, once they've adopted a certain way of doing things, find it very hard to change. So again, they struggle to incorporate diverse information, or, as the real world really is, information that just seems to conflict and doesn't add up. Yeah. So those are the people, for instance, who are very susceptible to adopting conspiracy theories, which are nice and simple. It's black and white. Those are the enemies. Those are the good people. This is how it works. Yeah. So this is sort of cognitive style. Another variable I just want to mention refers to the moral values that people hold. So all of us throughout our lives are socialized in order to understand and know what is right and wrong to do. And, you might think that it is obvious that everyone believes that it's wrong to use violence. But that's not the case. Some people develop moral values that make it acceptable to use violence for certain missions, for certain goals, or with respect to certain groups and people, yeah? And so if someone gets socialized in an environment where it seems okay to use violence, yeah? So I'm thinking of experiences of domestic violence, experiences of war, civil conflict around you, etc., yeah? That is an environment in which people grow up to possibly, this is not deterministic, but it is possible that you then adopt more values where violence is more justifiable. And those individuals then, of course, if exposed to, let's say, a violence inciting narrative, they are more vulnerable to adopt that because they already hold the belief that it's okay to use violence. Someone who holds very different moral beliefs, who rejects the use of violence altogether, will be less vulnerable, yeah? So this is how we, if we think about, again, protecting individuals from those exposure effects, those would be some of the groups that we should be focusing on. Yeah, so throughout our socialization, we get taught what is right and wrong to do. And that, of course, also includes the use of violence, yeah? And now, some might, based on their experience, develop the value that it is actually okay to use violence. What might be some of those experiences? So it could be experience of domestic violence, could be experiences of war or civil conflict to which one is exposed. But it could also be growing up in a household or in a community that over generation has embraced the use of violence towards another social group. One example here would be Northern Ireland, where we see that there are generations, yeah, of supporters of both sides of the conflicts, where kids grow up learning that it is okay to kill the British. And it would, of course, be very surprising if someone like this then does not follow through in those footsteps, yeah? Now, this is not to say that everyone whose parents, whose grandparents, whose family is a terrorist or a violent extremist also becomes a violent extremist. It's not deterministic. However, those individuals are more susceptible to the influence of information that promotes the use of violence. One scenario is a scenario of increased identity threat. So this could be a situation where I use now the example of white supremacy. Could use any other as well, but this could be an example where an individual who strongly believes in white supremacist ideas sees that as a core part of their identity, and then experiences certain developments in society or in the economy that basically consider a realistic or a symbolic threat, meaning there could be a large increase of immigration in their community, or there might be certain global developments, right, that suggest that white people are actually at threat. Our way of living, yeah, is at danger. So if this core aspect of your identity is threatened, then it is proposed that people actually very much retrieve into these what is called echo chambers or filter bubbles. Not just online, yeah. It's important, these phenomena are often studied only online or discussed online. They obviously exist offline as well, and for some people even more so offline. So it just means that if you experience this threat, you retreat into a environment that feels very safe and that basically confirms your identity, that confirms your white supremacist identity. While maybe before you were speaking to people who also held different ideas, you no longer do that. Yeah, your circle might become smaller, and so on. And through that, your attitudes then no longer just become maintained or stay at a stable level, but this is when we then could also expect that they become more extreme. So the narrower your space of diverse opinions becomes, the more likely it is that your attitudes actually become extreme. So for someone to then actually get to the point where they also would decide to use violence to pursue those goals, it will take much more. It will not just be being exposed to certain material online. So one thing that has, for instance, been identified in the literature on terrorism is that people need to not just derogate or, feel negatively about a certain group, let's say immigrants, but they also need to actually dehumanize them. They need to start no longer looking at them as human beings. So we move from holding prejudice towards dehumanization. Here I especially want to point out a paper by Soral and Bilevich that looked at the relationship between exposure to hate speech and prejudice towards the communities that are the targets of that hate speech. And they explored that relationship for individuals who do not yet agree with the hateful messaging. Yeah. And so what they showed is over time, people find it less shocking. They find it less bad. And that is, of course, that's quite concerning. Why? Because if hateful language is considered less shocking, not so bad, it means that if you, for instance, were to observe an incident of hate crime or hate speech in the real world or online, you're less likely to intervene. You're less likely to help the victim, less likely to speak up or make a report to the police. Yeah. So this is one possible relationship that, I think we definitely want to explore more empirically, but is concerning. And this sort of desensitizing effect that repeated exposure to violence can have has been established in other fields as well. Another contribution that Soral and Bilevich made is that they explored what this repeated exposure to, for instance, hate speech could have on the social norms that govern our behavior. And they argued that if I, for instance, repeatedly see another person talking negatively or dehumanizing a minority group, I might come to consider that this is an acceptable way to speak about this particular group. And over time, I might even come to realize that this is how I should also be talking about this group. Yeah. This could then, over time, lead to a point where people who are initially not at all agreeing with this kind of messaging, with this kind of way of speaking to each other, could not just leave it be and not speak up, but might also adopt it themselves, and therefore, of course, change in a possibly drastic way how society engages with one another, how different groups in society speak and behave to one another. If we think about the role that, let's say, the general public could take, first of all, what the general public can do is speak up when they observe certain material online that is extremist, that is maybe violent extremist, yeah? And here it's on both sides of the political spectrum, or also addressing certain single issue topics. So in the UK, again, hate speech is a criminal offense. So if you observe hate speech online, this could and should be reported to the police. Barely anyone does it, But this is not just the responsibility of the victim, but any bystander can make that report. Of course, you can report material to the platforms themselves to have it removed. This is how you can address the issue of prevalence. In addition to that, internet users can also engage in what is called counter speech. So reporting an incident of hate or extremism online, that is what we would call quite passive bystander behavior. And in many cases, this is the right thing to do because it doesn't place the bystander at, well, there's no risk, right? No potential harm. But sometimes people may choose to actually actively engage with either the victim or the perpetrator or the actor, the individual that disseminates the extremist material online. Yeah, so this is what we call counter speech. You might point out explicitly that this is not acceptable, that you don't agree with this, or you might try to engage in a discussion. Now, whether this is effective or not cannot be guaranteed. Supporting victims, providing comfort, that is most likely to be very effective. But engaging with, I use the term perpetrator, but that's not always correct. It's only correct if it's actually illegal content. Basically anyone who promotes extremist or let's say anti-immigrant opinions, if you engage with them explicitly, it might also make things worse. So here, I don't want to provide that as a silver bullet to solve everything, but it is on the big menu of possibilities that the general public have, obviously a possibility. And then, well, if we take a step back and we think about what brings someone to actually develop those extremist viewpoints, again, can be on either side of the political spectrum. It is those factors, of course, and they could be macro levels at the societal level. They can also be individual experiences that ideally we can address so that ideally nobody develops the grievances. Nobody develops an experience of discrimination. Nobody feels threatened. Nobody feels inferior. And I realize that I'm sort of describing here a world that we would maybe all want to live in, but we also realize is probably impossible to create. But ultimately, we should be aware of the fact that, if individuals develop extremist ideas, that does not happen in thin air. It happens in a certain political, social, economic climate. And we do know that inequality, discrimination, perceived injustice, all of these are experiences that drive people to reject the establishment, to reject the government, and so on. So if I had a wish, then yes, I would love to create a world in which everyone is equal, everyone is well off, everyone is healthy, and perhaps in that situation we would experience overall a lot less extremism and violent extremism. And anyone can probably take small actions every day to at least make sure that the people around them feel valued, feel like they belong to their community, don't feel like this is not their home, or experience a sense of injustice.